Relax. They missed. The voice came through the command bunker speakers with forced confidence. Somebody inside the underground shelter laughed nervously after hearing it. But First Lieutenant Emily Carter wasn't laughing. She stood pressed against the concrete wall beneath Ain al-Assad Air Base in western Iraq, while warning sirens screamed above the compound. And deep down, she knew something was wrong. Very wrong. The bunker lights flickered violently again. Dust drifted from the ceiling onto soldiers packed shoulder to shoulder inside the shelter. Phones buzzed nonstop. Radios crackled constantly. Nobody could hear clearly anymore. Outside the bunker, somewhere across the darkness of the Iraqi desert, Iranian ballistic missiles were already in the air. Hours earlier, everyone on base understood retaliation was coming, because only 5 days before, President Donald Trump ordered the strike that killed Iranian General Qasem Soleimani near Baghdad International Airport. The news spread through every American base in the Middle East instantly. Some soldiers celebrated. Others stayed quiet, because experienced troops understood something younger politicians in Washington often forgot. When you kill someone powerful, the response eventually comes back. And tonight, it was coming directly toward Ain al-Assad. Emily adjusted the chin strap beneath her helmet while trying to steady her breathing. The bunker smelled like sweat, concrete dust, and fear. Nobody admitted the last part out loud, but fear lived there anyway. Across the shelter, Sergeant Mike Donovan sat beside the communications equipment staring at the floor silently. 22 years old. First deployment. He kept checking his phone even though there was no signal underground anymore. His wife back in Dallas was 7 months pregnant. 10 minutes earlier, he whispered to Emily, "If something happens, tell her I tried calling." Emily never answered him properly, because soldiers stopped making promises during moments like this. Another siren suddenly screamed louder overhead. Then came the first impact. Boom! The entire bunker shook violently sideways. Several soldiers fell instantly against each other. The concrete ceiling groaned like it might split open completely. Someone near the rear of the shelter started praying out loud. Another explosion followed immediately after. Then another. Then 4 more in rapid succession. The Iranian missiles weren't random. They were precise. Outside the bunker, million-dollar helicopters exploded into burning metal. Fuel depots ignited. Shockwaves ripped through buildings across the massive desert base. And underground, the pressure waves kept hitting harder. Emily suddenly felt something strange happen inside her skull during the third explosion. Not pain exactly. Pressure, like invisible hands, squeezing both sides of her brain at once. Her ears rang violently afterward. For a second, she couldn't hear anything except high-pitched static. Then suddenly blood ran from somebody's nose nearby. A soldier collapsed unconscious against the wall. Another started vomiting beside the entrance tunnel. Nobody understood yet what was happening, because there were no visible injuries, no bullets, no shrapnel wounds, no missing limbs. Just invisible damage spreading through human brains every time another missile detonated nearby. And the explosions kept coming. Boom! Dust burst downward again across the bunker. The lights went black completely this time. Darkness swallowed the shelter instantly. Several soldiers shouted at once. Emily grabbed the wall to stay standing while her vision blurred violently. The pressure inside her skull worsened again after the next detonation. Somewhere above them, another missile slammed directly into part of the air base. Mike Donovan suddenly looked toward Emily through the darkness. Blood trickled slowly from one of his ears now. "Lieutenant," he whispered weakly, then stopped speaking entirely, because he forgot what he was trying to say mid-sentence. Emily felt cold move through her chest immediately. That terrified her more than the missiles themselves. The bunker shook again, and somewhere thousands of miles away in Washington, politicians were already preparing press statements before the attack even finished. The missile barrage lasted less than 2 hours, but for many soldiers inside Ain al-Assad, the damage would last forever. When the explosions finally stopped, silence spread slowly across the bunker. Not relief, shock. Dust floated through flashlight beams while soldiers sat against the concrete walls trying to understand what just happened. Emily Carter pushed herself upright carefully. Every movement felt delayed somehow, like her brain needed extra seconds now to process simple commands. The ringing inside her ears still screamed violently. Nearby, Sergeant Mike Donovan stared blankly at the floor without blinking. "Mike!" Emily asked softly. No response. She crawled closer across the bunker floor and grabbed his shoulder. "Mike!" The young sergeant looked toward her finally, but his eyes looked wrong. Unfocused, confused, he opened his mouth slowly, then asked the same question again he already asked 3 minutes earlier. "Did they hit us?" Emily felt fear twist deeper into her stomach, because now she understood something invisible had happened underground tonight, something worse than cuts or burns. The bunker doors finally opened roughly 30 minutes later. Cold desert air rushed inside, carrying smoke and the smell of burning fuel. Outside the shelter, Ain al-Assad looked apocalyptic. Fires burned across sections of the base. Concrete walls collapsed inward. Vehicles sat overturned beside impact craters glowing beneath emergency floodlights. One helicopter lay broken in half near the runway. And everywhere, soldiers walked around dazed like survivors after an earthquake, some bleeding from ears, some vomiting beside buildings, some unable to remember where they were supposed to report. Yet strangely, almost nobody had visible combat wounds. No gunfire, no firefights, just invisible trauma buried deep inside human skulls. Military doctors moved frantically through the chaos with flashlights and medical kits. "Any headaches? Blurred vision? Can you follow my finger?" At first, commanders believed the injuries were minor. Concussions maybe. Temporary shock. That's what everyone hoped anyway. Then soldiers started collapsing hours later. One intelligence analyst suddenly forgot her own access codes she used every day for 2 years. A communications operator suffered seizures during equipment checks. 3 Marines became violently disoriented while trying to walk across the compound. And First Lieutenant Emily Carter could no longer read properly without nausea. Doctors finally started using the phrase nobody wanted to hear: traumatic brain injury. TBI. The word spread across the base, quietly at first, then faster. By sunrise, evacuation helicopters already waited on the runway. Germany, Kuwait, eventually the United States. Soldiers who looked physically unharmed suddenly found themselves strapped into medical transport flights because blast waves had scrambled parts of their brains internally. Emily sat beside the runway medical station, wrapped in a gray blanket, while medics checked her pupils repeatedly with flashlights. Every loud sound hurt now. Every bright light stabbed behind her eyes. She watched Mike Donovan loaded onto a transport aircraft nearby. He looked terrified, not because of blood, because he kept forgetting where he was. "Where's my wife?" he asked one medic. Then 5 minutes later, asked the same question again. A young Navy doctor finally sat beside Emily, holding a clipboard full of neurological notes. "You need advanced imaging," he said carefully. Emily rubbed both temples slowly. "I'm fine." The doctor looked exhausted already. "No, Lieutenant." He paused briefly. "You're really not." That same morning, officials in Washington started briefing the media. At first, the official message sounded simple. No American soldiers killed. Minor injuries only. Base remains operational. Television networks repeated the phrase constantly. Minor injuries. Meanwhile, inside military hospitals, overseas, doctors watched grown soldiers break down crying because they suddenly couldn't remember words mid-conversation anymore. One staff sergeant forgot his daughter's birthday. Another woke up screaming every night after the blast pressure damaged parts of his nervous system. Some couldn't sleep. Some couldn't focus. Some developed migraines so violent they vomited daily afterward. And still, publicly, politicians kept minimizing everything. 3 days later, President Donald Trump stood in front of cameras and spoke about the attack casually. "I heard they had headaches," he said. Headaches. That single word exploded through military communities instantly, because soldiers watching from hospitals in Germany and the United States nearly threw things at television screens hearing it. Headaches? Tell that to the Marine who forgot his son's face for 20 seconds. Tell that to the soldier vomiting blood after panic attacks. Tell that to the intelligence officer who couldn't drive anymore because sudden noises triggered neurological episodes. Inside Walter Reed Military Hospital, Emily Carter watched the clip silently from her recovery room television, then slowly reached up and turned the TV off herself. Not angry anymore, just disappointed, because suddenly she understood something painful. The explosions in Iraq weren't the only thing that broke trust that night. Weeks passed before the full truth started leaking out publicly, not because the injuries were hard to identify anymore, because too many people in Washington wanted the story controlled first. At Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, hallways quietly filled with soldiers from Ain al-Assad. Most looked physically normal. That was a disturbing part. No casts, no missing limbs, no dramatic bandages. Just exhausted young men and women sitting beneath fluorescent hospital lights, struggling to remember conversations they started 30 seconds earlier. First Lieutenant Emily Carter hated mirrors now, because every time she looked at herself, she appeared completely fine, and yet her brain no longer worked the way it used to. Some mornings she forgot simple words midway through sentences. Other mornings she woke up unable to tolerate sunlight, without nausea ripping through her skull. One afternoon she burst into tears in the hospital cafeteria because the sound of plates clattering together suddenly felt physically painful. The neurologist called it blast-induced traumatic brain injury, but the soldiers living through it had simpler descriptions. "It feels like Parmy stayed in that bunker." That became one of the most repeated phrases among the wounded afterward. Parmy stayed there. Emily heard it from Marines, Army mechanics, communications specialists. Even Sergeant Mike Donovan whispered it one night while sitting beside the hospital window, staring at the parking lot below. The young sergeant looked older now somehow. Not physically, mentally exhausted. He rubbed both hands against his face slowly before speaking. "My wife says I repeat stories now." Emily stayed quiet. Mike laughed weakly afterward. "Apparently I told her the same thing 4 times yesterday." The laugh died quickly, because neither of them found any of this funny anymore. Outside the hospital walls, the political damage control had already begun aggressively. Government spokespeople kept using phrases like non-life-threatening injuries, symptoms under evaluation, minor traumatic effects. Minor. The soldiers hated that word almost as much as headaches, because there was nothing minor about forgetting your child's birthday. Nothing minor about panic attacks triggered by elevator vibrations, because your nervous system now confused every low-frequency sound with incoming missiles. And definitely nothing minor about watching your military career quietly disappear after neurologists started questioning whether you were still fit for duty. Emily's Purple Heart ceremony happened 3 months later. Small room, limited press. The Army tried presenting it respectfully. But even standing there in dress uniform, receiving the medal, Emily felt disconnected from herself somehow. The migraine still came almost daily. The memory lapses still happened unpredictably. And now cameras wanted photographs because she became symbolic, the face of invisible wounds from Ain al-Assad. One photographer quietly asked her afterward, "Can you look proud for one more picture?" Emily nearly laughed hearing it. Proud? She spent the previous night vomiting from another neurological episode, severe enough doctors considered rehospitalizing her. But nobody photographed those moments. Only the ceremony, only the medal, only the patriotic image politicians preferred. Meanwhile, veterans organizations across the country grew increasingly furious after hearing President Donald Trump repeatedly downplay the injuries publicly. At one Veterans Hall in Phoenix, an old Iraq War Marine actually threw a beer bottle at the television after hearing the word headaches again during a news interview, because combat veterans understood something politicians often didn't. Blast injuries don't always bleed publicly, but they still destroy lives. Emily learned that personally when the Army quietly informed her she would likely never deploy again. Too many neurological complications. Too many documented symptoms. One doctor explained it gently inside a consultation room. Your brain has experienced trauma patterns similar to severe concussion clusters seen in professional fighters. Emily stared at him silently. "I was never knocked unconscious." The doctor nodded sadly. That's what makes blast injuries terrifying. Another pause. The damage happens anyway. Back in Washington, political advisors continued arguing over media strategy surrounding the attack. Some officials wanted stronger acknowledgement of the injuries. Others worried admitting the true scale publicly would make the Iranian retaliation look more successful politically. And buried somewhere underneath all those calculations were actual human beings trying to remember who they used to be before the bunker shook apart around them. The nightmare started before the physical recovery even finished. That was one of the cruelest parts. The body healed faster than the mind. At Walter Reed, soldiers from Ain al-Assad began waking up screaming in the middle of the night, so often that nurses stopped reacting visibly anymore. Some heard missile alarms in their sleep. Others relived the bunker shaking apart around them over and over again. Emily Carter stopped sleeping more than 2 hours at a time. Every loud noise snapped her awake instantly now. Hospital carts rolling down hallways, doors slamming, even thunder during rainstorms. Her nervous system no longer understood the difference between normal sound and danger. One neurologist described it carefully during a therapy session. Your brain still thinks the attack is happening. Emily stared at the floor quietly afterward, because deep down, that explanation felt horrifyingly accurate. Sergeant Mike Donovan got worse before he improved. At first, doctors believed rest and rehabilitation would stabilize most symptoms quickly. Then Mike forgot his own apartment address during a phone call with his wife. A week later, he accidentally left the sink running for nearly 3 hours because he walked into another room and forgot entirely what he'd been doing. The Army officially labeled him non-deployable shortly afterward. 22 years old. Career essentially over before it fully started. One afternoon, Emily found him sitting alone outside the hospital, smoking despite never smoking before Iraq. Mike stared across the parking lot, silently before speaking. You know what pisses me off most? Emily sat beside him quietly. Mike laughed weakly without humor. If I came home missing a leg. He paused. People would understand. Silence settled between them, because he was right. Invisible injuries confuse people. Friends said things like, "But you look normal. At least you survived. You're lucky it wasn't worse." Lucky. The soldiers from Ain al-Assad began hating that word too, especially after politicians kept minimizing what happened publicly. Then came the interview that pushed many veterans over the edge completely. During a press appearance, President Donald Trump again referred to the injuries dismissively while comparing them to headaches and saying they were not very serious. Inside veterans' hospitals across America, phones exploded with anger immediately afterward. Retired Marines posted furious videos online. Combat medics called radio shows demanding apologies. Families of wounded soldiers started speaking publicly for the first time. And Emily Carter? She simply sat in silence, watching the interview replay on television inside the rehabilitation lounge. Then finally whispered one sentence nobody else in the room forgot afterward. If his brain got hit by that bunker pressure one time. She stopped briefly. He wouldn't call it a headache. Nobody answered her, because there wasn't really anything left to say. The backlash grew rapidly afterward. Veterans groups accused the administration of downplaying traumatic brain injuries for political convenience. Former commanders publicly criticized the comments. Some active duty soldiers grew furious privately but stayed silent publicly because careers depended on it. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, military neurologists quietly admitted the full number of injured personnel kept increasing. First it was 11 soldiers, then 34, then over 100 diagnosed traumatic brain injuries connected to the attack. The number shocked even experienced combat doctors, because modern missile warfare created a terrifying reality. You could survive physically while parts of your brain never truly recovered. Emily's Purple Heart photograph eventually spread everywhere online. News articles, military pages, veterans groups. People called her brave, strong, a symbol of sacrifice. But nobody saw what happened after cameras stopped recording. The migraines, the memory therapy exercises, the panic attacks during fireworks, or the night she collapsed crying in a grocery store because the overhead speaker system suddenly triggered flashbacks so violently she thought another missile attack had started. That became the hidden reality of Ain al-Assad survivors. Publicly celebrated, privately shattered, and somewhere underneath all the politics and press conferences, many soldiers started realizing something darker. The missile attack itself wasn't what hurt most anymore. It was a feeling that people in power wanted the story cleaned up neatly afterward. No messy truths, no permanent damage, no uncomfortable political consequences. Just headlines, statements, moving on quickly. But traumatic brain injuries don't move on quickly. They follow people home, months after the missile attack. First Lieutenant Emily Carter still woke up some nights thinking the bunker ceiling was collapsing again. The doctors called it neurological trauma mixed with anxiety conditioning. Emily called it simpler. Part of my brain never left Iraq. By summer, she could drive again most days. Most days. But sudden loud noises still made her hands shake automatically on the steering wheel. Crowded places exhausted her. Bright supermarket lights triggered migraines. And every time politicians appeared on television talking casually about war, something inside her tightened immediately. One evening, Emily sat alone in her small apartment outside San Antonio, watching another interview with President Donald Trump replay across the screen. The same confident tone, the same easy language about strength and retaliation and showing power. Emily stared silently at the television before muttering quietly to herself. He talks about missiles like they're numbers on paper. Another pause, but we were inside those explosions. The television kept playing. Trump spoke about toughness, about enemies respecting strength, about America never backing down. Emily felt anger slowly building behind her eyes. Not political anger anymore, personal anger. Because none of the men giving speeches in Washington were trapped underground inside Ain al-Assad, listening to concrete crack above their heads. None of them watched 22-year-old soldiers forget their own wives' names for 30 seconds at a time afterward. And none of them sat inside military hospitals pretending traumatic brain injuries were just headaches. Emily grabbed the remote harder unconsciously. My friend still throws up during thunderstorms, she whispered toward the TV. He can't even hold his daughter sometimes because his hands shake. Another pause. But sure, headaches. She shut the television off after that. Not because she stopped caring, because she cared too much. Across the country, veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan started speaking more openly now, too. Some defended Trump fiercely. Others hated him for what they believed was political recklessness mixed with public disrespect afterward. But almost everyone agreed on one thing privately. The people making decisions about escalation rarely carried the consequences personally. The soldiers did. Always the soldiers. Meanwhile, overseas, the Middle East kept getting hotter. More attacks. More retaliation, more warnings from intelligence agencies about Iranian-backed militias preparing additional strikes. Every news alert made Emily's stomach tighten automatically now, because she recognized the pattern already. Politicians on television pretending control still existed, while soldiers quietly prepared for the next disaster underneath it all. Then one night, another crisis exploded across the headlines. Iranian missiles. Israeli retaliation, American forces repositioning again. Cable news channels suddenly filled with maps, red arrows, and phrases like potential regional escalation, broader conflict possible, U.S. response under discussion. Emily sat on her couch staring silently at the screen while helicopters flashed across the live footage from the Middle East. And deep down, she recognized the same feeling from Ain al-Assad before the missiles arrived. That horrible moment when everyone knows things are getting worse, but nobody in power seems willing to stop pushing forward. One retired Marine being interviewed on television finally said what many veterans already felt privately. Everybody loves escalation until young Americans start coming home broken. Emily whispered quietly at the screen afterward, or don't come home at all. The fear growing among veterans wasn't just about Iran anymore. It was a feeling that history itself was repeating. Big speeches, tough talk, pride, retaliation, and somewhere underneath all of it, Young soldiers loading onto aircraft again while politicians argued on television thousands of miles away. Emily checked her phone late that night. Messages from former Ain al-Assad soldiers filled the group chat constantly now whenever tensions rose overseas. You seeing this? This feels bad. They're pushing too far again. And one message from Mike Donovan stopped her completely. Simple. Only one sentence. Feels like nobody learned anything from us. Emily stared at the message a long time afterward, because honestly, she feared he was right. The bunker at Ain al-Assad survived the missiles physically, but the people inside carried the damage home permanently. And now, years later, many of them watched the same political language return again. More threats, more escalation, more promises that strength alone would solve everything, while soldiers quietly prepared for consequences politicians would never truly experience themselves. Outside Emily's apartment window, thunder rolled softly across the Texas sky. She froze instinctively for half a second before reminding herself it wasn't another missile strike, just weather. But her nervous system still couldn't fully tell the difference anymore. And somewhere far away across another desert, more young Americans were probably already sitting inside another bunker, wondering whether the people making decisions above them truly understood what explosions actually do to human beings.